cul-de-sac. Most rounds began as early as 4 or 5 in the morning, the milk float trundling at no more than 10 miles per hour, headlights cutting through the mist. Notes tucked in bottlenecks saying 2 pints today, please spoke to a trust that ran deeper than any receipt. For many, the day's first conversation was a quiet greeting exchanged over a doorstep, coins pressed into a chapped hand, news of the neighborhood passed in brief. These rituals thrived in a world without big fridges or 24-hour shops, when fresh milk on the step was as certain as the morning itself. Yet, as supermarkets spread and home refrigeration became the norm, the familiar ring of the milk float faded, and with it, the milkman's place in the daily rhythm of British life. What was once an everyday exchange, simple and human, became something remembered, a small ritual that defined community and that most of us now only recall in memory. A single phone line in the hallway, fixed to its little table, set the boundaries for every conversation. Calls were rationed by cost and by earshot. No secrets from the family, no long chats without a watchful glance at the clock. Outside, the red phone box stood at the corner, coins clinking through the slot, the receiver heavy and cold, your breath fogging the glass. In 1985, British Telecom began quietly thinning out these boxes, citing fewer calls and rising costs as more households got their own line. At the same time, the answer phone tape hissed in the background, recording messages with a mechanical whir. Most messages were still scribbled on scraps by whoever answered first. Down the street, the corner shopkeeper kept a ledger under the counter, a handwritten tick book for credit on bread, milk or cigarettes until Friday's pay. Trust ran on a handshake and a running total, the sweet jars glinting behind the till. Supermarkets with their bright aisles and cash-only rules soon made these small favors, and the shopkeeper's quiet watchfulness less common with each passing year. Friday night meant a trip to the video shop, shelves packed with glossy VHS sleeves, each one a promise of adventure or a laugh. Families crowded the narrow aisles, debating over which film to take home. No second chances, no pause or rewind, just a single choice to fill the weekend. The shop owner, sleeves rolled up, kept a wary eye on the racks and a list of banned titles tucked behind the counter, thanks to the new 1984 Video Recordings Act. Police sometimes came by, checking for nasties, tapes with names whispered about at school, now strictly off limits. Back home, the tape clunked into the VCR. Everyone squeezed onto the sofa, snacks at the ready. With only 3 or 4 channels on the TV, and no way to record, Saturday mornings belonged to live kids shows, cartoons, pop stars, and phone-ins, watched in real time, pajamas and all. If you missed it, you missed it. By the end of the decade, big chains would swallow the independents, and the familiar faces behind the counter would vanish, leaving only the memory of those communal nights and the thrill of the rewind button snapping back to the start. A single press of the remote's teletext button brought up the CE fax grid, with blocky headlines, rainbow bars, and news that loaded one slow page at a time. For many, it was a morning ritual, checking the weather, the football score, or the TIVE listings, all in chunky blue and yellow squares. But the living room was not the only place where screens flickered to life. In bedrooms across Britain, cassette tapes whirred and hissed as new mixtapes took shape, recorded off the radio, painstakingly timed to catch the start of a favorite song, each one labeled in biro on a folded inlay card. Passing a mixtape felt like handing over a secret, a message and a mood, a crush hidden in the track order. And just down the hall, the glow of a microcomputer lit up the wallpaper. The cassette drive screeched as games loaded stripe by stripe, and lines of basic code appeared, typed out by hand. Some kids wrote their own programs, sold them by mail order, and dreamed of seeing their names in Crash or Your Spectrum. These were the first bedroom coders, swapping code and ideas in a pre-internet world. Whether reading news in block graphics, sharing tapes, or writing games, everyday life was quietly splitting between shared browsing and private creation. Both roads led, in their own way, toward Britain's digital future. Inside the office, a steady clatter of typewriters filled the air, each keystroke echoing across rows of typists in the typing pool. Fingers stained faintly blue from carbon paper, they worked through stacks of forms, the sharp scent of Tipex lingering as mistakes were blotted out and retyped. Every document meant a fresh sheet, each letter a careful ritual. No second chances, no quick edits. Meanwhile, children poured into playgrounds, pockets stuffed with string and the hardest conker they could find. There were no goggles, just the crack of chestnuts and the sting of a near miss, the rules made up on the spot. At break, the tuck shop beckoned, crumpled dinner tickets traded for penny sweets, crisps and a panda pop if you were lucky. By the end of the day, both office and playground ran on routine and trust. But the first signs of new rules, healthier snacks, and stricter supervision were already on the horizon. Evenings belonged to the PUB, where the air hung thick with a blue-grey haze and the tang of tobacco clung to every surface. Regulars nursed their pints beneath a drift of smoke, voices softened by the fog, ashtrays crowding every table. Cigarettes were as much a part of the ritual as the beer itself, passed around, tapped out, stubbed and relit, with no thought to the warnings now printed on every packet. Amid laughter and low conversation, few questioned the cost to their health. The haze was a social glue, binding strangers and friends until closing time. This nightly fog would linger for years yet, but the evidence against it was already stacking up, waiting for a future when the air would clear for good. Memory softens what progress erases. As everyday life grows ever more digital and distant, the smallest routines reveal what we risk losing next. What is your most vivid memory from 1985?
The night of January the 31st, 1953. Along Britain's east coast, children slept through icy winds rattling frosted windows. No alarm sounded as an unseen surge rose in the dark, and then within minutes whole towns vanished beneath black, freezing water. 300 lives were lost overnight. Families were trapped in their homes while asleep, caught in their beds as water rose. Emergency services were overwhelmed by darkness, by the cold, and by rising water. This disaster changed national defenses forever. So why has one of Britain's deadliest New Year catastrophes been all but forgotten? Lowestoft on a winter's evening felt safe behind drawn curtains. The day's last trains rattled by the station, and shopkeepers pulled down shutters against the cold. In the terraced streets near the docks, families settled into familiar routines. Kettles whistled, wireless sets hummed with music, or the gentle drone of the BBC Home Service. The news, such as it was, carried little more than a mention of rough weather and a high spring tide expected overnight. Few paid attention. High tides were part of life along the East Coast. Parents tucked children into beds layered in scratchy woolen blankets, the air tinged with coal smoke and the promise of another ordinary Sunday. Outside, the wind pressed harder against window panes, but it was nothing new for January. Doors were bolted, slippers set by the fire, and radios clicked off one by one. The only warnings came as vague forecasts, no alarms, no urgent messages. The sea was close, but it had always been there, just beyond the dunes and the low brick walls. Some neighbors swapped stories about the last big blow, but most believed the defenses would hold. After years of rationing and slow repairs, the town had learned to accept what it could not change. Children drifted to sleep listening to the distant horns of ships on the North Sea. A mother in a small bungalow checked the latch on the back door, feeling the draft that crept under the sill. She glanced at the clock, just past 10. The radio, now silent, had carried no hint of danger. In kitchens, the last embers in the grate faded to red. A grandfather wound his pocket watch and set it on the bedside table, the tick echoing in the hush. Some families kept boots by the door out of habit, but few expected to need them before dawn. The old men who remembered the floods of their youth were mostly gone. The new generation trusted in the sea walls, however patched and battered they might be. The night deepened, and outside, the wind began to howl. Yet inside, the world shrank to the small comforts of home, warm beds, familiar voices, the soft clatter of dishes stacked to dry. In the darkness, the tide crept higher, unnoticed. The only sign was a faint, salty smell drifting through the cracks. No one imagined that before morning, the world outside those walls would be swept away. Just after midnight, the sea wall at Jaywick gave way. There was no warning, no time to prepare, only the roar of water as the North Sea surged over the defenses and crashed into the sleeping town. In the small bungalows near the shore, the first sign was a low rumble, then a sudden violent jolt as icy water burst through doors and windows. Within minutes, floors vanished beneath a rising tide. Linoleum peeled up, furniture floated, and the cold swept into every corner. Families were wrenched from sleep by the shock of water at their bedsides. Blankets soaked through in seconds. Some tried to force open doors, only to find them jammed by the pressure of water and debris. Others scrambled for higher ground, but in Jaywick's single-story homes, there was nowhere to go. The surge filled rooms chest deep. A mother clutching her child found herself pressed against the ceiling, searching for air as the darkness closed in. Outside, the wind howled through broken fences and garden gates, carrying the cries of neighbors calling out to each other. The sea, relentless and cold, swept through narrow lanes, lifting cars and garden sheds, tearing away anything not anchored down. Streetlights flickered and died, plunging the town into blackness. Some residents managed to reach their roofs, battering open attic hatches or smashing windows with bare hands. Others, trapped inside, pounded on walls, hoping someone outside might hear. But the water kept rising, swirling with mud, seaweed, and fragments of everyday life. Children's toys, photographs, the contents of kitchen drawers. In those first minutes, the sense of safety that had settled over Jaywick hours earlier was washed away. The sea wall, patched and neglected for years, offered no resistance. The surge moved faster than anyone could react. By the time some realized what was happening, it was already too late to escape. The cold was bone deep, the darkness absolute. For many, the only hope lay in climbing, clinging, or waiting for daylight. In the silence that followed the initial rush, only the sound of water remained, lapping, swirling, carrying the memories of ordinary lives swept up in a disaster no one had seen coming. On Canvey Island, the disaster struck with a force that shattered any sense of order. Minutes after the surge hit, the island was plunged into total darkness. The power grid failed almost instantly, leaving more than 11,000 residents without light or heat as the cold seeped through every wall. Street lamps flickered and died one by one, casting the bungalows and chalets into a blackness broken only by the wind and the frantic shouts of neighbors. The floodwaters had come so quickly that the main electricity substation was overwhelmed before engineers could respond. With the cables submerged and transformers drowned, there was no chance of restoring power until the water receded. Houses that had seemed safe just an hour earlier now felt like traps. Without electricity, the only sounds were the storm outside and the rising panic inside. Communication collapsed just as swiftly. The telephone exchange, already strained by the weather, fell silent as the lines shorted out. Calls for help never reached the mainland. Emergency operators could do nothing but listen to static, while families on the island were left cut off, their voices lost to the night. Even radio sets, once a comfort against the dark, fell quiet as batteries failed and water crept higher. Volunteer crews, men who hours earlier had been finishing late shifts or sharing a pint, gathered at the edges of the flood. With no working phones or radios, they relied on word of mouth and their own instincts. Some tried to wade through the freezing water, carrying lanterns or torches that guttered in the wind. Others commandeered tractors and lorries, engines sputtering as they pushed through flooded lanes in search of stranded families. Roads that had connected Canvey to the rest of Essex vanished beneath the tide. Bridges were swept away or rendered impassable, isolating the island completely. Rescue teams on the mainland could only watch the distant glow of torches on the roofs, unable to reach those in peril. For the people of Canvey, the blackout was more than a loss of light. It was a severing of every link to the outside world. Inside the homes, the cold deepened. Without power, coal fires sputtered out and pipes froze. Candles were scarce and the damp crept up the walls. The silence of the phone lines and the dead radios made the night feel endless. In that darkness, every minute stretched, and the only certainty was that no help was coming soon. The island's isolation was absolute, and for those trapped by the rising water, survival depended on whatever could be done in the dark. In the terraced streets of Great Yarmouth, the flood arrived as a silent invader. Water seeped beneath doors and along the cracks of old brickwork, finding its way into bedrooms where families slept, unaware of the danger rising outside. The first sensation was often a chill, icy water lapping at ankles, soaking through mattresses, turning sleep into panic. In one narrow terrace, an elderly couple woke as their bed began to float. The husband, disoriented, tried to stand but slipped into water up to his chest. He called for his wife, who clung to the bed frame, her nightdress heavy and cold. The darkness pressed in, broken only by the sound of neighbors shouting through the wind. Across the street, a young father forced open a window, calling out for help as water climbed the stairs. He could hear children crying in nearby houses, voices muffled by walls and the relentless rush of water. In these moments, survival depended not on official rescue, but on the people next door. Neighbors tied bed sheets into makeshift ropes, passing them across alleyways, steadying each other as they waded through waist-high water. In some homes, families climbed into attics, hammering at roof tiles with whatever they could find, shoes, chair legs, even bare fists, hoping to break through before the water reached them. On the outskirts of Lincolnshire, the flood moved with a different kind of quiet. Farmhouses stood isolated, surrounded by flat fields that vanished beneath the tide. An elderly couple, both in their 70s, woke to the sound of water slapping against the walls. By the time they reached the door, the hallway was already knee-deep. The man tried to open it, but the pressure from outside pinned it shut. They retreated to their bedroom, water rising past the window ledge, soaking the rag rugs and swelling the wooden floorboards. The couple climbed onto the bed, holding hands as the water crept higher, the cold biting through their clothes. In the darkness, they listened for any sign of help, a lantern, a voice, the engine of a tractor. But the only sound was the wind rattling the eaves. Elsewhere in the fens, a neighbor braved the flood in a battered rowboat, guided by the faint glow of a candle in an upstairs window. He called out, his voice nearly lost in the storm, and found a family huddled on a dresser, their dog barking at the water swirling below. He ferried them to safety, making trip after trip through the black water, his hands raw from the oars. In Great Yarmouth, a dock worker smashed through a back door to reach an elderly neighbor trapped in her kitchen, lifting her onto his shoulders and carrying her through the flooded streets to higher ground. The water did not discriminate. It filled parlors and pantries, swept through kitchens and bedrooms, leaving behind a silence broken only by the sound of neighbors calling out to each other. In every town and village, ordinary people became rescuers, risking their own lives to pull others from the dark. For many, the night was spent perched on rooftops or huddled in attic corners, teeth chattering, waiting for the first light of dawn. The flood reached bedroom height in some inland farms, leaving families stranded for hours before help arrived. Each act of rescue was quiet, often unseen. But it was these moments of neighborly courage that carried so many through the longest night of their lives. When daylight finally came on Sunday, the scale of the disaster revealed itself in cold numbers and silent streets. Officials moved from house to house, marking addresses on sodden lists and counting the dead where they found them. By the end of that first day, the toll stood at 307 lives lost across England. In Essex, the names of whole families appeared on hastily written registers. In Norfolk and Suffolk, the task of recording the missing fell to police constables and parish clerks working in borrowed boots, their hands numb from the cold. The floodwaters had receded in places, leaving behind a landscape of ruined homes and empty cribs, water lines scarring the walls. News dispatches carried only the starkest details: how many perished, how many were still unaccounted for, how many homes were now uninhabitable. Lists of the dead grew by the hour, each name a life ended in the night. The official record could not capture the quiet devastation left behind. But it was all the authorities had to offer as they began to piece together what had been lost. In the aftermath, the landscape became a gallery of silent witnesses. Clocks in parlors and kitchens, their hands frozen at 1:26, marked the exact moment the water claimed each house. On farmhouse walls, the tide left a brown stain just below the family photographs, a permanent reminder of how high the sea had reached. In the fields beyond the villages, the salt had turned the earth pale and lifeless. Rows of turnips and winter wheat, once green, now lay flattened and rimmed with white, the harvest ruined for seasons to come. Livestock carcasses dotted the ditches, tangled in barbed wire or stranded on the crowns of embankments. Along deserted lanes, a child's pram sat half submerged, its wheels caked in silt. a sodden blanket still inside. In some homes, the only sound was the drip of water from the rafters onto ruined carpets. The flood had swept away more than buildings. It had erased the ordinary markers of daily life. What remained were these mute objects, each one holding the weight of a story that would not be told aloud. Today, much of Britain's coastline stands protected by barriers forged in the wake of that silent catastrophe. Yet with sea levels now rising faster than at any point in recorded history, the question shifts from how we remember 1953 to how prepared we truly are. The cost of forgetting is not just lost memory, it is risk. For those who live by the water, history never stays buried for long.